Hello and welcome to our webinar today, Rethinking Compliance from Tick Box to Adaptive Practice. In this webinar, I'm joined with Dr. Tristan Casey from NewView Safety to explore why so many safety systems give us false confidence and what we can do about it. So we dive into real-world gap between rules and work and the trade-offs that leaders face and how adaptive compliance can move us beyond box ticking exercises. So let's get into it. Welcome to the call, Dr. Tristan Casey.
G'day, thanks for that. It's great.
So I'm sure many on the call will already know you, Tristan, but in case anyone doesn't, Dr. Casey is a seasoned scientist practitioner with experience across private consulting, academia, and government. He's an endorsed organizational psychologist with over 15 years experience in the practical management of health, safety and well-being, and Dr. Casey has developed numerous award-winning training programs, measurement tools, and academic publications. He's a keen advocate of the positive links between safety, well-being, and overall job performance. And I had the pleasure of seeing you present some of this content at the Bright Star event in Auckland, and we had a great chat after that. And I was keen to do a webinar because I think it's such a tricky space. We have to navigate compliance, but also compliance is under pressure. So just to help us set the scene, I'm interested to know, you described this burning platform, and I guess it's this disconnect between the activity and actual risk reduction around compliance. So from your perspective, why do you feel so many organizations fall into this trap of surface compliance? And what do you think is holding them back from something more meaningful?
Yeah, sure, Ben. No, thanks for that. And it seems like so long ago we met at that conference. It's gone quickly, and really great to be here today. I think we'll sort of just set the scene a bit by talking. You mentioned surface compliance there, and that's sort of the academic way of describing what you mentioned, which is that tick the box, minimal effort being put into compliance activities, just to sort of get them done and move on to the next task. So it's sort of this cynicism, I guess, this idea that we've got the paperwork, the bureaucracy, but are we really seeing the intent of why it's there, or have we drifted away from that and into this perhaps space where we feel it's non-value adding? So surface compliance is a big issue. We see it a lot. It's sort of one of the biggest challenges that I've heard about in my kind of consulting career over the past few years. Many organizations, I guess, experience it where they're just frustrated. They have obviously compliance requirements, and a lot of those compliance activities feed into their assurance, systems where executives and managers may want to understand how much sort of safety do we have, and the compliance activities are meant to give an indication of just how much safety we have. But if it's surface, if it's tick the box, of course, there's a disconnect there, and we're not getting the high quality information or accurate information that we need to feel safe and secure. So just to sort of expand on your original question, the burning platform, I think there's a few things happening here. The first is something, I guess, around the regulatory context. And as many of the listeners today would be aware, in the Western world, we have typically a lot more of the principle-based laws and legislation. Of course, we have some prescriptive elements in the regs and other sorts of, in specific industries like the mining sector, maybe a little bit more prescription. But overall, if you look at the Health and Safety Act, it's very much this principle-based or goal-based approach of, we want you to achieve this outcome. Of course, there's codes of practice and other guidance about how to achieve it. But for many businesses, there's this sort of ambiguity around what is the best way. Just tell me what I need to know. We hear that from small businesses a lot. Just if the regulator could just tell me what I needed to do as a minimum, I'd do it. So there's a double-edged sword there. We've got the flexibility that the legislation affords and allows businesses to figure out the best way that suits them for their risk context and their business operations. But the other hand, other side of the coin, it's a challenge because businesses have to navigate that ambiguity. So I think the regulatory context itself kind of sets up this surface compliance, because businesses perhaps just put something in place to tick a box themselves and are not quite sure whether it's really the right activity for them, or they take something off the shelf and implement it, which has its own challenges from an engagement perspective. Just as a sort of a little tangent, there's a really interesting paper that I remembered this morning, which was by Stian Antonsen from Norway, and he talks about this big change in the Norwegian petroleum industry, where they just put this little element, this one little piece into their laws for the petroleum sector, which said ensure a sound HSE culture. And that little ambiguous line generated a whole host of helpful and unhelpful side effects. Sort of the consulting industry boomed because consultants were trying to fill that gap and provide solutions. It encouraged organizations to look for new and innovative ways to solve safety challenges and explore how to achieve better cultures. So I think the key point is regulation drives, has its sort of explanation, it explains a bit of the service compliance problem. Just quickly, the other piece I'd add, that says the regulatory context, and I think there's also a lot of myths of safety that drive this kind of bureaucratic entrepreneurialism, as Sydney Decker calls it, this kind of expansion of rules and documentation and paperwork that might not add value. I think one of the myths that drives that is this sort of belief that unsafe acts are the proximal or the immediate cause of incidents. This sort of idea that in traditional safety, for better or worse, it's helped us for many decades, but now we're seeing, that kind of belief run its course. And, to continue to focus on behavior as the immediate cause of incidents is sort of not going to continue to generate the value that maybe it has in the past. Systems becoming more complex. It's more complex than just one unsafe act or one issue. From a behavioral perspective, there's much more richer explanations we can have. So I think, just to summarize, regulatory context, the myths of safety management can drive surface compliance.
I forgot to say as well, we welcome questions in the chat as well. If we're going along with something you wanted to ask Tristan, we'll take them as we can as we go along. So you touched on the regulatory context, but you've talked to me before about the minimal viable compliance lens, and how that can also lead to some safety theatre where, you're doing compliance activities for appearances rather than effectiveness. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I don't think it's because it's like, when you sort of said that to me just then, I was sort of thinking, the moral aspect of it, is the organization doing something wrong or improper? I don't think it necessarily gets to that level. It's more just the fact that there is a compliance requirement in the organization seeking to fulfill that in the way that's most efficient and value creating for them that they can think of. So I think just the risk of that sort of safety theatre or sort of acting like safety is occurring creates this false assurance at the management level, as I sort of mentioned at the start of the session. This notion that management think that the compliance is driving the right types of safety activities, but ultimately it's not generating the outcomes that they think it is. And so a green 100% compliance across the board in terms of their measures and metrics, everyone's doing their training, compulsory training modules, the safety leadership walks are happening, we're getting our number of quoted hazard reports happening each month. The risk there is that the executives sort of sit back and think, yes, this is all okay. Our organization's safe, and there's not really much we need to do to, like, they sort of rely on that information too much. At the leader level, at the management level, there's that false assurance. At the frontline level, I think there's two challenges that workers experience as a result of this: is cynicism and the experience of tension. So cynicism in the sense that, well, the organization's kind of imposing these compliance duties on us, or activities we know they don't add value. We sort of lost sight of the intention of why they're there. That might not have been communicated to us very effectively. So you've got that disengagement. But then also the tension, this sort of idea that I'm doing a compliance activity that's kind of a layer above the work. It's sort of seen as a separate sort of parallel process, rather than being integrated and supporting the work to be successful. So a little side example is the written risk assessment. For some context, of course, it is required that you have a detailed written sort of JSA or take 5 or whatever sort of process you have. But for many, sort of 80-90% of the time, it's not required. Yet organizations sort of force their people to write these things down and document them. Does that really help? Like, the intention of the task is to draw attention to risks and to ensure adequacy of controls, but surely a different way of getting there would be a very rich, structured conversation led by the supervisor of the team, getting the people together to really hash out what this risk is and how to manage it. That's really what we want them to.
Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper into this compliance gap then that appears when you've got this tick box mindset. So can you tell me a little bit more about that disconnection between, the procedures and actually what's going on at the front line?
Yeah. So I sort of was collaborating with one of my academic colleagues, Xiaowen, who's from QUT, now she's in the UK, and we sort of had this idea that the compliance challenge is this difference between the ends and the means. What I mean by that is the outcome and the process. So you've got this sort of outcome, which is, we want to achieve a level of compliance and improve safety, but the means or the methods or the process that we use to get there, sometimes we sort of trick ourselves or kid ourselves into thinking there's one best way, there's one prescriptive way that achieves that outcome. Where adaptive compliance challenges us is to say, look, there might be multiple ways of getting to that outcome. You're still achieving the compliance outcome. We're not confusing the fact that the outcome and the method don't necessarily have to be locked in or linked together. Sort of getting back to your original question, I think the key issue is that growing gap between the work as done and the work as imagined. If people would be familiar, perhaps, with that growing concept is, the way that the procedure or the rule, the compliance requirement says things should be done often don't match how it actually is done, and that could be because there's a difficulty in the design of that process or procedure. It's not fit for purpose. People are innovating; they're under pressure. So the first thing to go out the window is perhaps that superfluous perceived compliance duty, and so the work practices drift away from where the organization wants to be. That sort of drifting into failure that the academics call it. So
Yeah.
lots and lots of stuff happening there, I guess, in terms of that growing disconnect between practice and plans.
Yeah, and you could be doing everything right, but also failing to actually reduce the risk.
Yes, yeah, well, that's right. I mean, that's the real challenge for organizations, is that false assurance that we talked about. The other big challenge or risk, I think, is the loss of capability, potentially, amongst the workforce, because if the organization has this view that everything has to be proceduralized and documented and 100% prescriptively dictated to the workforce, that sort of reduces that sense of autonomy, that sense of control over the way the work can be done. And, you get to the point of that mining industry analogy of check your brain at the gate. That sort of cliched statement that gets thrown around, that, the industry is so heavily regulated and compliance driven that workers feel, I don't have any real agency here. It's just more follow everything to the letter. And that's really what the organization wants to do. It's almost this disempowering approach to compliance, where we want to substitute your expertise for a written document. Otherwise, the academic circles call it coercive compliance or coercive bureaucracy, where it's this traditional mindset of, the person, we have to compensate for the person's shortfalls, we have to overprescribe and take that skill set into a formalized procedure or document.
I'm interested a little bit more around that improving the frontline capability and decision making under real conditions, because we were talking a bit about this in New Zealand, because I was saying it's a bit analogous to how the old school military versus the new school military, where one is very prescriptive, just do what you're told. The other pushes a lot more decision making down, say, to the front line, where conditions are unfolding, empowering people within a strategy, I guess, to be able to make decisions that are right in the moment. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, and also, I guess, the limitations of moving people if they've come from a frontline environment where they haven't had any freedom, to how do you start to get into that way of working?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think when it comes to that, like the second part of that question, if you've sort of been indoctrinated or haven't had a way of being managed in an organization that limits your control or autonomy, it can be perhaps overwhelming, because uncertainty is one of the things that adaptation and flexibility creates. And humanity as a species, as human beings, we don't often like uncertainty. We like things to be stable and predictable, and know what's coming. But some of the academic literature is saying that there's actually a helpful a helpful way of looking at uncertainty and safety. So a lot of safety is about reducing that uncertainty and ambiguity. Limiting, controlling, constraining, trying to make the environment as stable and predictable as possible. But there's actually advantages, having an increase in uncertainty, because that encourages proactivity, it encourages innovation, it encourages creativity. I think the question for organizations is, a risk-based approach, such that we have, very high risk, critical risk in our business, that we know them really well, we know the control measures that work the best. That's not a time to potentially increase adaptation and variability. That is perhaps a time where we use our traditional control constraint-based approaches and maybe prescriptive ways of doing work, because if you think about the efficiency thoroughness kind of spectrum, that's a time for thoroughness. That's where we make that trade-off and say we want this job to be slow, careful, safe, because if it goes wrong, it'll go terribly wrong and massive big risk to the business. But other times there might be more of an opportunity to swing back to the efficiency space, and that's where the increasing or sort of reducing the leash on the workforce and allowing them to experiment and to have that adaptive capacity can be really helpful to achieve both safety and productivity goals together. So I guess I've kind of gone a bit of a roundabout way there, but I think, going to the philosophy of it, it's sort of recognizing that there are tensions and trade-offs here, and trying to think about how am I managing those tensions, and just adopting a more strategic way of thinking about it.
Well, let's drill down a bit more then into that trade-off that can happen with efficiency and thoroughness. So with that tension between what the frontline needs to do to get the job done and what the systems demand in terms of control, assurance, can you tell us a little bit more of that trade-off between efficiency and thoroughness and why it matters so much when we're trying to make compliance actually work?
Yeah, no, that's great. So we could probably take a little conceptual step back and think, what are we really talking about here? And the academic world calls them paradoxes. I like to use tensions because it's less kind of intimidating language, but everyone knows what a tension is, what it feels like. It's this psychological strain or sort of indecisiveness about where do I turn. It almost connotes the image of a tug of war, and that's what happens in safety a lot. Is on the one hand, compliance requires stability and prescription in some respects. And the tension there is that, well, people like flexibility and autonomy and sort of that ability to make decisions for themselves where they can. So the tension between stability and flexibility is a real fundamental one that influences how organizations do compliance. If the pendulum swings, heavily towards either extreme, we either have a micromanaging organization where it's so locked down and rigid that people, don't feel they have meaning or purpose, or perhaps quite dissatisfied with their working conditions. Flip it to the other extreme, maximum flexibility, maximum uncertainty, that can be quite anxiety driving, and people may feel unsure about whether they're working on the right things, different tangents going off in different directions. The extreme ends of the scale always create problems, I think. And that's something for us and the industries around Australia to reflect on, is how are we managing these tensions? Are we thinking in a binary kind of yes or no, good versus evil kind of way? Or are we thinking more of a complementary, and I like to use the yin and yang, the night and day, the sort of the two come together. They're both different and potentially antagonistic, but if you look at them from a different perspective, they're actually both required, to sort of move forward. And the same thing for many tensions in safety. If we run the risk, if we fall into the trap of trying to be decisive, heroic, pick one option over another, we lose sight of the fact that maybe a balanced, integrative approach is actually going to get us the better outcome, the more sustainable, long-term outcome.
So the goal then isn't to necessarily eliminate the trade-off, but just to manage it more wisely.
So I think, well, I mean, if you integrate, if you adopt a binary approach, you're making trade-off decisions. You're choosing one option over another, like a tunnel. You're kind of looking down the tunnel. But if you start to look for more creative ways of solving these tensions, such as integrating them, I could sort of talk about a few strategies. So let's say, temporal separation, doing one thing and then moving to the next goal after you've satisfied that initial, goal. So if we think about a production environment and the staff are lifting up, heavy boxes, okay, we focus on the lifting task, we do that really thoroughly. Then we move back to our production task and do that really thoroughly and efficiently. Or we do structural differences. So we have one team that's kind of the safety lifting people and some people are the production people. Or we try and integrate and say, well, let's create a lifting device that actually eliminates the risk completely and makes the job more efficient. So there'll be multiple strategies up that you can have up your sleeve to deal with tension. I think it's more just opening your mind and thinking differently about, hey, there is a tension here. Rather than thinking I'm under pressure and stress to choose one option over another, I'm going to try and look for a different way to navigate through this. And that, I think, makes compliance more nuanced than just this quantity, how much compliance do I have, and more about the quality of the compliance I'm really achieving.
Right. Okay, so we've covered some of the theory and the trade-offs, and if anyone has any questions about any of that we've moved on from, just drop them in the chat and we'll pick them back up. But let's look at grounding this a little bit now in what this adaptive compliance starts to look like on the ground. Can you walk us through some examples or approaches that help teams move beyond that tick box mindset and actually start working with more flexibility and intent?
Yeah, so we can probably just spend a moment unpacking what adaptive compliance really means. We've talked about surface, which is that tick the box. The one we haven't really mentioned today is deep compliance, which is that sort of shift from surface to something that's more meaningful. We do the risk activity because we know the value of it. We sort of get the why. Adaptive is the next sort of phase or flavor of compliance. And that's where we've sort of disconnected the method from the goal or the outcome and said, look, maybe there's some alternative ways that we can reach that end goal that don't look like the way that we've written down in our procedure, but still achieve that compliance outcome that we're thinking about. So I can talk about an example from one of our clients. So it was in the nuclear industry over in the UK, and it really sticks with me, this one, where they were sort of doing a really difficult fuel rod extraction operation. They decommission nuclear reactors and these sorts of high risk tasks. And the situation where they said, look, this task is going to be, it's either going to cost us a lot of money, or we're going to have to adapt and change the way that we think about compliance. So they grabbed the experts, they brought the engineers together, they even invited the regulator, the nuclear safety regulator, to come and discuss and brainstorm ways to do this task safely, but also efficiently and at a good cost. So the adaptive compliance part was that the goal was to extract the fuel rods and do that in a way that wasn't going to cause unnecessary risk to their people. They achieved that. They did it collaboratively. They got the regulator on board. They went around their procedures, but they still achieved the intent of what those procedures were there to ensure. So that's a bit of an example, but if it would help, we could talk a little bit, Ben, about some of the strategies to do adaptive compliance, or that might help.
Absolutely. So because you were mentioning before around, when's the right time for flexibility? When's it not appropriate? And we've talked before around some of those, like you're alluding to, those collaborative processes where you can work with other stakeholders on risk mapping, scenario planning, getting that conversation going.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a few practical ways of enabling adaptive compliance. We can probably maybe talk a bit later about the leadership or the individual characteristics, but here's sort of the more operational stuff that might work. So the first thing I think is about making the safety boundaries visible, and what that means is if the audience is familiar with Jens Rasmussen's sort of dynamic risk management model, he talks about different boundaries conditions and creating this envelope of safe space. And what that conceptually means is we've got wiggle room. We kind of got this sort of zone of safety where we can do our tasks and sort of not end up having an incident because we're kind of in this safe space. But pressures of economy and sort of production pressures to do the task quicker and more efficiently push us often to the edge of that safe zone, this sort of boundary condition of safe and unsafe. And so many traditional safety and compliance activities exert a counter pressure. They try and push us back away from that edge, push us back back into the safe zone. But what adaptive compliance sort of encourages us to do is to think about different control strategies, not just pushing people back, but saying, okay, let's give you better skills to cope at the edge, so that if you fall over it, you can get back quicker. So there's emergency response and sort of in the moment dynamic risk assessment to ensure that this emerging challenge is being managed well. We can create innovative techniques to make the safety zone bigger, so that we've got more capacity to be able to do our tasks safely and not worry about the edge or the zone. Actually get some more performance increases out of our people. So I think making those boundaries visible and noticeable, what's safe, what's not safe, what are our non-negotiables, what are our minimum standards, what are the things that we do have to do very prescriptively, otherwise, things will go very wrong. That's just as much a formal system characteristic as it is a conversation, a high quality, rich conversation you would have with your people as part of a pre-start meeting or something else to establish what those safety boundaries are for that task. Another one would be around making things safe to fail, and not just from a control sort of energy management model, safe to fail, but also from a psychological sense of if we, do an experiment or we sort of simulate, talk through what could happen before we adapt and actually do this thing. Being mindful of the environment, the climate you're creating in that team, such that people can speak openly, the diversity of views is forthcoming, and as a consequence, we get a much more well-rounded assessment of what could go wrong here and how do we ensure it goes right. So yeah, I think there's a couple of ideas there, but maybe if there's anything, Ben, you wanted me to unpack more, or I'm not sure.
Well, I guess as well, like thinking about low risk work as well, as an opportunity where more flexibility might be appropriate, and it may actually be a good space to pilot or trial more adaptive approaches in an organization.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it's interesting. I've sort of been reflecting on this idea of the low risk work, and another thing that I hear from industry is, well, the routine kind of everyday stuff is where the injuries happen, unfortunately, because the high risk work is fortunately seems to be managed very well. But maybe what's happening there for that routine work is that there are arduous compliance requirements, and they're sort of adding the cognitive and physical burden to the task. They're making it such that there would be opportunities to remove some of those compliance activities, or actually adapt and change them such that they're less arduous, freeing up people to be able to devote more attention into what the work is and making it successful.
So I missed a question in chat. I'm sorry, it wasn't refreshing for me, but I'll ask it now for you. Have you seen any good examples of organizations establishing safety barriers that support autonomy of workers and setting up a safe sandbox as such for workers to operate in and innovate?
I was trying to think of something there that might be. Oh, okay. There's one that comes to mind. So it's probably less of a barrier, but just more of something that enables that autonomy to come to life. So I was in a previous life, I was working at a regulator, Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, and I was introduced to a refinery here in Brisbane. And they had this really interesting concept called the Blue Zone. They had this space where people could come, the workers could come before they start their day. And it's almost like a pre-start on steroids, where they'd have this visual board and perhaps little magnetic tiles, and just this sort of a really rich conversation they could have about what's the task coming up today. Okay, we're picking our control measures, identified our risks. It's really interactive and hierarchically flat. So, it would just be the team. There would be no sort of senior leadership there. And they'd really debate and discuss, okay, how are we going to tackle this? They've got the visual tools and the cues to be able to to really have a rich conversation about that task. So I think that's not necessarily a hard physical barrier or control, but it's an example of where the intent of the traditional compliance activity has been reimagined in a way that builds engagement, builds autonomy. People have ownership over the discussion. Yeah.
Another question here from Sam. Commonly, tick and flick compliance activities are quite easy to track in a quantitative way,
Mm.
which fits neatly into a scorecard that senior leadership can appreciate. Can you talk to practical ways in which an organization can track and report on some of the intent outcomes that we're hearing about today?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's yeah, that's the big trap is this sort of 100% compliance achieved. The concept of what I'm trying to communicate today is quantity of compliance is one thing, but we want to look more at the quality of compliance, and I think that means being more innovative in exactly what we're measuring. So if you've got this sort of framework of different flavors or types of compliance, now with differentiated surface from deep from adaptive. Every organization would have different desired profiles of those compliance that they would want. For a very tightly regulated, very high hazard industry, sort of nuclear power, not really relevant to Australia, but that's the example, would be more in that deep compliance space. We really want people to be able to achieve very kind of meaningful compliance activities. But in perhaps a more nimble organization, and some of the special forces military type organizations come to mind as an example, where they kind of embrace risk, they go into risk situations. The capacity and capability to adapt is crucial for success. They don't want their soldiers and their special forces officers to really just be following prescriptive rules and just waiting for the command and control to tell them what to do. They want to be able to adapt on the fly. So I think getting back to the original question with the reporting, it's being creative in terms of how can we assess the quality of that compliance rather than just saying, have people done it or not? So, for example, moving away from just numbers that have attended training or numbers that have signed on to a training sheet, reporting on, the extent of training transfer, the quality of that training actually making it back to the workplace, and the behaviors that are changing, or the impact that training's having on the organization. That's just one example that comes to mind as something you could look at.
Seems like no easy answers when the seductive green dashboard is so easy to understand. Our last webinar was with Georgina Poole on random noise and looking at some of those historical measures of safety, which don't necessarily hold water exactly as they're intended to as a predictor of future safe outcomes. And I guess what you're saying with this flexibility and adaptability, it might not be as easy as having a metric in a dashboard.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's probably also just thinking about what would those metrics look like. I and getting more nuanced in terms of what we're reporting to our boards, because the trap that organizations fall into is a bit of a side note, is that kind of outcome based approach, LTIs and sort of incidents that occur. But from a decision maker's perspective, what do they really do with that? And I think that's similar to the 100% compliance modules, or get more compliance, or make people comply more. It's not giving us any intervention points. So I think looking more at the antecedents of that compliance, potentially leadership capabilities to help adapt people to adapt, situations where we've required adaptation and it's been successful, learnings and lessons, from difficult situations. So more of a qualitative approach to that reporting, I think.
Yeah. So did you want to jump in then, Tristan, a little bit more on the leadership side of this then, and actually what it takes, what kind of leadership it actually requires to have this approach to
Yeah.
adaptive?
Yeah, we sort of been thinking about this, and it really comes down to a concept that we're calling adaptive leadership. It's sort of how does a leader manage their own kind of reactions and responses to uncertainty and ambiguity, but also kind of lead and inspire their teams to feel confident to be able to do this adaptation themselves. So starting with the individual, I think it's this comfort with uncertainty and being able to work through uncertain situations. It doesn't come naturally to everyone, of course. Some people will have different tolerance levels for uncertainty and ambiguity, but that sort of systematic exposure, going into perhaps training sessions where you're asked to adapt and in a safe environment kind of figure out the way through that helps to build that resilience and that sort of psychological management of I'm feeling uncertain. I don't know what to do as a leader. Everyone's looking to me. That kind of implicit pressure that people would put on themselves. How to navigate that and take a calm sort of step back and think, okay, I don't necessarily have to come up with the answer. How do I leverage my team, to achieve the best result here? The second piece is, I think, that tension-related thinking, or that paradoxical leadership. The idea that as a leader, we can elevate ourselves beyond the binary yes or no, comply versus non-comply, and say, well, maybe the situation calls for a bit of both. How do we comply but also not comply? It's sort of this contradictory outcome, which in the Western world we're not used to thinking that way, but in the Eastern world and in Asia and China and whatnot, that's a very common concept, and it's sort of that exemplifying the yin and yang that I talked about before. This sort of sort of duality type thinking of that there can be different alternatives, but we can bring them together and try and unify them and integrate them together. So that's the second one. So sorry, it's a long-winded thing of saying manage tensions better. And the second, I think, third, sorry, is around psychological safety. That sort of almost cliched thing that gets thrown around a lot, but it does matter for compliance and adaptation. Because without that sense of feeling able to take an interpersonal risk and voice up a concern, to be able to challenge the status quo, the team will not be successful because they'll miss something, and it could go horribly wrong. So comfort with uncertainty, managing tensions, creating psychological safety in the team.
And then what else needs to change then, I guess, in the way the systems are set up to support that kind of thinking and behavior on the ground?
Yeah, so there's a leadership aspect, but then also the organizational design part, which would be around, establishing what your minimum compliance requirements are. What are the non-negotiables in your organization? I think Lend-Lease, one company that comes to mind calls them as global minimum requirements. It's sort of consistent standard across all jurisdictions and areas. And that's sort of your starting point to say, okay, this is where we need to get to as a minimum, and sort of anything above that potentially is up for grabs in terms of adaptation and more flexibility at the local level. So, establish and communicate what those minimum requirements are. And many organizations, I think, would leverage their critical risk management frameworks to be able to set that standard and their control measures accordingly. The second piece for systems, I think, is around this balance between devolving decision making to the front line, but then with corporate or centralized oversight. Because the last thing you probably want is for everyone to be running off, adapting all your procedures and processes, and not, no feedback loop coming back to the regulators, and then I mean that as in terms of the safety function, the safety team, to be able to pick that up, assess it, make sure it's working, and there's no invisible or unnoticed risks that are entering the work process. So, escalations for approvals, if you're in an operational environment, who do you call or who do you engage to help you verify that your adaptation is safe and it's authorized? I think that can be a way of managing that tension. And lastly, when we train compliance, rather than sitting people down and saying, here's the manual of SOPs, go and read them all, maybe think, is there a way that we can start to train this safe adaptation mindset where, more scenario-based approaches? Hey, we've got this realistic situation. What procedure would you apply, and how could you get around maybe some of the challenges and pressures that might come up on the job? So it's really improving your training capability to move away from just this rote learning or lecture-based approach to say, let's work it through. Let's practice the skills required to be adaptive and figure our way through this situation.
Another question in chat. Has adaptive compliance been discussed in courts, case laws? If yes, can you share an example?
Oh, good question. I'm not aware of it. I think, looking at people like Greg Smith and his paper safe concept, that's probably more the distinction between surface and deep compliance. I'm not really aware of the legal. I haven't looked at the legal case outcomes or anything to see whether adaptive compliance is in there, but I might do that. Thanks for the pointer, inspiration.
So Tristan, I'm interested in what practical final thoughts we might be able to give someone that's looking to take a foothold with adaptive compliance. As you said before, there's an element of like this Taoist path of no path. It can be quite esoteric to sort of
Yeah,
all
sure.
these, these different things at different times. Like, but ultimately, this is about giving the space where it's appropriate for the best answers to situations to be able to play out, not be stifled through,
Mm.
the tight grip of either surface compliance or our preconceived ideas about what's happening. If an organization was looking to start moving in this way, what sort of strategic first steps would you recommend based upon some of the successes and failures of the organizations that you've seen over the years trying to navigate this tricky space?
Yeah, I think for this as a starting point, it's probably trying to gather the evidence that you do have a surface compliance issue because it's very opinion based, it's very subjective, and often organizations just might not want to know that that they do have a surface compliance issue. So I think it's picking, the right time to raise that as a concern, but also, having the hard data behind you to sort of uncover and surface that this is something the organization should be caring about. So given the link between surface compliance and false assurance, I think it's usually an executive kind of board discussion or influencing kind of moment where if strategically you as a safety professional or your safety team, you want to innovate and start to shake up the metrics that your organization's using. They're relying on the lagging too much. They're not looking at the lead or the driving metrics or the monitoring metrics. Um, I think that's a place to start is to potentially put together a bit of a sort of a surface compliance audit presentation or report, potentially a little white paper on what these concepts mean, and try and educate your board that maybe the data they're looking at is not accurate. Like it's not helping drive good decision making about risk and control management in organizations. So if it were me, I think it's less about hey the surface compliance issue and more about using that as a lever as a leverage point to improve the way that safety performance is understood in your organization. So sort of up leveling it to a bigger issue.
Question from Robin in the chat. Is this aspect of risk management not dealt with already in the creation of a swim or safe work instructions? These are obviously highly consulted and at the right level.
Um, yeah, I think safe work like swims tend to sort of focus on critical risks and also are reasonably prescriptive. I think they cover off the high risk work, but perhaps where we're talking about now with adaptive compliance is challenging that notion that we have a one size fits all compliance approach in our organization and more of a nuanced kind of dynamic approach where it's situationally based or risk based, so that if we do have opportunities to provide maybe options in a procedure to do certain things in certain ways or the critical steps of these, but here's where you've got some decision making authority to be able to choose different methods to get to the outcome. That's where I think adaptive compliance can start to help.
Another question in the chat from Chris. Generational conflict, ignorance, recitance is a real hazard. How do we get serious about the risk?
They're trying to have a think about that one. Not quite sure if it means sort of like different generations of in the workforce, like longer time people versus newer people and different approaches to risk, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Um, yeah. Chris, if you want to ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's but it's suggesting that this reactance and the status quo and the way things are is part of the hazard. It becomes the familiar shape. It's like the memory foam pillow. It goes back to its original form. It's very actually hard to shift the psychology of how we look at some of this stuff, and we've done it a certain way for a very, very long time. And now this radical new way, which is potentially like a bit more free range, like let the kids figure things out themselves, may actually be a factor. I don't know if I've misrepresented what you're saying, Chris, but talking to a lot of health and safety people, from what I hear, that's actually a challenge with maybe more of an adaptive process, that it goes against the status quo of how it may have been done for a very long time.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think it's sort of different stakeholders have different concerns with these approaches, and again, it's thinking from a tension mindset or the paradoxical way to say, there's opportunities to provide reassurance at either end of the poles of the competing goals. So from a stability perspective, yes, we want to make sure we've got oversight, we've got perhaps our safety management team providing approvals and being aware of what's going on in the adaptation space. But on the flexibility side, building capability of our people to make good adaptive decisions, to have ongoing continuous risk assessment practices in place, to be able to, diagnose some of the challenges and work as a team, as a group effectively to, get to the successful work outcome.
Great. Okay. Well, unless there's any more questions in chat, any final thoughts, Tristan, that you'd want to leave the audience with today as a key takeaway, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's just more that kind of central theme of today, which is think beyond compliance as a quantity and asking questions like how much compliance do we have, and say what's the quality of compliance and what's sort of the profile of compliance that we have, and what is there a gap between that, what we have and what we want to achieve with our compliance profile. So I think that kind of different questioning helps you have a richer, more effective implementation of your safety management system.
Yeah, and obviously navigating shades of grey can sometimes be very contextual to the business.
Yes.
If you're in a situation where you need help navigating that, I strongly encourage you to reach out to Tristan and UView Safety, who are great at shining light on how to actually get through some of these questions. What's the best way for people to reach out to you, Tristan, if they want to have a conversation with you about this?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So you can navigate to our website, NewView, thenewview.com.au, or you can email me at info@thenewview.com.au, and we'll get back to you. It'd be great to hear from you. Thanks.
Appreciate so much, Tristan, joining the call today. We love having great thought leaders on that challenge and provoke ways of looking at things so that we can adjust our lenses to greater opportunities. If anyone on the call would like to reach out to us as well, we'd love to talk about the data and technology side of this journey. So feel free to reach out to us at any stage if you'd like to have a chat. And we'd like to thank everyone who joined the call today and wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.